Hello, I'm the Pink Phantom. Welcome to my podcast, where we will go deep into the lair of the purple worm instead of down into the rabbit hole, where we'll voyage into the astral realm of my mind and explore the verse of nerd culture. This is Phantom Thoughts. In this episode, we're going to have a fair number of call-ins. It's going to be call-ins and my responses. Up front, I do need to apologize to Jason. He actually sent in a couple of call-ins that would have been in last week's episode, except for the fact that I still haven't gotten used to a post-Anchor Apocalypse world, and so I wasn't as diligent at checking my social media for responses and did not actually get to his. So it wasn't you, Jason. I wasn't trying to, it wasn't that I didn't want to include them or anything. I didn't see them till I'd already put out the episode. But thank you for emailing them to me. He had originally sent them to me on Discord. Joe has sent some to me on Discord in the past, so I did check it, but I guess I didn't check everything I should have checked. I'm still getting used to Discord. That's not really an excuse. That's just an explanation. So we're going to get into the calls. The last group of calls, we talk a little more about OSR and how to deal with what we've been calling bad actors and how this affects what's coming up with OctoSR, where we're going to try to promote the OSR a little bit in October. And I'm going to say up front that I do agree with what several people say, that we need to concentrate on the positive, and I haven't really meant to concentrate as much on the negative as I have in these last few podcasts. So this is probably going to be the last one where I talk about the bad actors. If anybody sends anything that makes a good point that we haven't covered, then I'll play that. I don't know what kind of response I'll have to that. But I'm going to put all that at the end if anybody is tired of hearing all that. So you're going to hear 3 call-ins from Jason that don't have anything to do with that. And then at the end, you'll hear from Jason, Kevin, and Spencer about a little more thought about the OSR and the circles we run in. And that is Jason from the Nerds RPG Variety Cast, Kevin from the Red Caps Podcast, and Spencer, a.k.a. Free Through All, from the Keep on the Borderlands podcast. All great podcasts. You should go listen to them. I will put links in the show notes.
Hey, Pink Phantom, this is Jason. Glad to hear you on the air again. Space Kings. Maybe it's because the commercials that are shown in the U.S., but it makes me think of an online sports betting service. That's not a negative on the game. It sounds interesting. I'm not quite done, about halfway through your episode, so I'm sure I'll have another call. I am curious on your thoughts on using cards as a randomizer as opposed to using dice. On the recent episode, most recent episode at the time of this call, a purple worm that's discussed. And I think if you're using the cards to do special things other than just a D54, right, other than a 54 section table, I think it can be interesting if the colors and the suits bring out different things. But if you're just using them as a randomizer, I don't know. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this on my show, again, time recording, on Sunday, my system Sunday, because I'm going to talk about a system that used tarot cards as a randomizer. And, with the tarot card, you got all kinds of different ways you can use that. So I think cards can be interesting, and they're really interesting things you can do, but I wonder the advantage of them if you're only using them as a randomizer. I'm not necessarily saying Space Kings is doing that. I'm just curious in general on your thoughts of cards versus dice as a randomizer.
Yeah, cards. They are they give you a lot of a little more flexibility than dice in terms of randomizing different things and applying to different things, because obviously you have the suits and you have the color, and then you have, of course, the numbers themselves, and those can serve to randomize different things in different ways, and they can also serve to combine in different ways. If you roll dice, you can obviously if you do multiple kinds of the same dice, or I mean, even with different denominations of dice, you could do it to an extent. You can do the Yahtzee thing where they're, you know, they're consecutive numbers 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 9, that sort of thing, or the numbers match. But with cards, you can do that, and you can do that with the suits and with the colors. So there's a lot of ways to mix and match. And something I just thought of when you were talking, it occurred to me that maybe that would be in a game where you wanted alignment to have kind of a mechanical effect. If you went with the sort of classic D&D alignments of law and chaos, that your randomizer, if you chaotic alignment, would be the dice, because when you roll a die, you're rolling a die. It could be 23 times in a row, maybe not, or it could be numbers, ascending numbers or descending numbers, or you could have the same numbers repeat over and over. But with a deck of cards, that's, it's 54 deck of cards. You know exactly what's in the deck. And so if you pull a lot of low number cards, there's a lot of high value face cards still in there. So for law, that deck of cards obeys exactly the law of averages. There's 4 aces, there's 4 kings, there's 4 sevens, there's 4 nines. And when you go through there, if you've seen 3 nines, you're going to see one more 9. So if you need a 9 for some reason, it's less likely to come up. If it's a system where you want high values and you get a bunch of 3s and 4s and 5s and 6s at the beginning of a session, you know that the higher numbers are coming. And that can influence what you do. You could do a more high-risk type maneuver because you're more likely to succeed because the randomizer is more likely to go your way. And that's something that a law type of character, where they have, their version of the universe, the gods they obey, the powers they obey, are lawful and orderly. They know that if their universe has been throwing a lot of sort of negative results their way, the positive is coming. Whereas someone in chaos, it's just random. It's whatever's going to come up. So I think that would actually be, a use that you could maybe have in a system or part of a system. I think it would probably work best of all with a magic system, but it could work in combat if you were, knights errant serving greater powers, and so you're going to have good swings, you're going to have bad swings, and it could come to where certain classes, or if you're following certain powers or deities, that you have the ability to manipulate that a little bit. Okay, I got this high value card, but I'm just fighting this low level mook, but I can flip over a couple more cards and take the lowest one that I think will let me succeed and mix the others back into the deck. Something like that. So, but yes, I think cards do have some rather unique applications that you can't necessarily replicate with dice. But that's not all you had to say in this call, because I split this call up. So let's see what else you have to say. With splitting your call, could that be a reverse Norton? Is there a name for that? Let me know.
So, the other thing I want to mention, I know I'm throwing a hodgepodge of things at you. That's the danger of the new frontier that we're in with messaging and calling and all that, with metagaming. So, to add to kind of what Joe's saying and what you're saying, I agree. I think metagaming is where the character, I think Joe said this, or you might have said it, but when the character's using the knowledge the player has, that's metagaming. And I agree with that, because there are a lot of games that have meta mechanics, right? Metacurrency in there, that you have to metagame to use that metacurrency. When do you spend a fate point? When do you spend a Benny in Savage Worlds? When do you spend a hero coin, right? And obviously it's metagaming when you're doing anything that requires you to if you have a free reroll during the game session, or you have the ability to automatically pass a test during the game session, then it's metagaming when you decide to use that. Or it's meta knowledge, right? But you can do it without the character knowing that you're doing it. and you could play it almost as a, like an Inspector Clouseau kind of thing. I know there are better examples, but that's one I'm thinking of. Maybe Mr. Bean as well, or Inspector Gadget. The idea where they succeed, but they don't really understand why they succeeded, right? So, I guess an example of that would be if you have the ability to do a reroll and you can, where you took a hit that was going to kill you and you're able to dodge that hit. You can say, oh, well, my character, he got wobbly and he slipped and the blade just went over his head and he thought, whew, what a close call. So it's not great character skill that caused that, and you could kind of play it up where the character, inadvertently survived the situation, but you're using that metacurrency. Because anytime you're using that metacurrency, it's a really blurry line. And I agree with Joe as well. The character builds are never metagaming, because especially in a game that requires it. If you're playing Pathfinder, you've got to plan your feats out. You don't have to, but you should plan your feats out, because certain feats have prerequisites. Savage Worlds is the same way. Savage Worlds suffers the same character build issues that Pathfinder does, or D&D 3.5, I guess. I never played D&D 3.5, but anyway, this is way long, so I'm going to let you go, and maybe I'll call you at the end of your next section, because you're about to talk about initiative as an attribute, and I have things to say about that. But I've already talked for 4 minutes. Eek!
Yeah, I think a character using purely player knowledge within the confines of the game is a pretty good definition of metagaming. And yes, lots of systems actually encourage metagaming with things like fate points and bennies. And even 5th edition, if you have DMs that give out inspiration, which when the current playtest document 1D&D, it looks like they're trying to encourage that to be done. That's metagaming, because you can just lay down that inspiration and get yourself a reroll, and that's not necessarily something that could be explained in the universe, but it's not necessarily something that your character would know. Because again, sometimes metagaming, it's all in how you express it, right? Your character has a knowledge, the player has a knowledge. Those two types of knowledge are related, they're adjacent, but they're not exactly the same, because the player knows it as percentages or something out of a book, but the character may know that exact same information because of experiences they've had in the game world. But yes, metagaming, metacurrency, it's all really comes down to what you want at your table. And that's going to influence the systems you choose, that's going to influence the way you express yourself, that's going to influence the type of play you have. And, whatever play style a group chooses to adapt is great. It's only a bad thing, really, if only some people are doing it, and they're doing it to get an advantage over the game master, or if it's a game master over the players, or if it's players because they're performing some sort of metagaming competition among themselves that ends up detracting from the fun at the table. If you're doing that kind of competition and it's fun at your table, that could work too. But yeah, I agree with that definition.
Considering how long my other messages are, I'll leave off the initiative as a tribute thing. I'm not a huge fan of it, I guess, but in this case, there are a number derived attributes, so it's not that big of a deal. If you only have a few attributes, initiative is one of them. I think that's kind of, I don't know. But if you have a bunch of derived attributes, I guess it's not a big deal. Anyway, I've talked long enough. Really enjoyed the review. It sounds like an interesting system. Yeah. So although I, like you, I have reservations about games where necessary parts of the games, like the character sheet, you have to go online to get. I mean, it's easy enough to go online and get it, print it off. So, not the end of the world, but 20 years from now, when somebody finds the hard copy of this book, then I guess they'll just make their own character sheet up. So, again, not the end of the world. Anyway, thanks for reviewing it. We'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, and the idea of online only content is it's funny. Before I started listening to a lot of RPG podcasts, I was listening to a fair number of board gaming podcasts, and that was kind of a bone of contention among some people in the board gaming community about games that used online apps as a necessary part of playing the game. It's like, but what if 10 years from now the app stopped working because it stopped being supported or the company is out of business? And one of the arguments has always been, well, I mean, with a board game, well, I mean, you played it for 10 years before it went out of business, and if you didn't, then you weren't playing it that often. So what are you really losing? Of course, with something as relevant as RPGs, as a character sheet, that could be a little different. But I mean, you can make your own. You go through the book and see we need these things and write them on a sheet of paper. I mean, that's what we used to do back in the '80s, right? We'd make it. There might be a sheet we could copy in the book, but a lot of times we were just writing down the attributes and writing down all the stuff our characters had and going with it like that. And in this day now, 2022, as I record this, people having stuff online is ubiquitous. There are companies that there's much to the chagrin of my parents that they much prefer you interact with them customer service wise through a bot on their web page, and eventually you might get to a person that way, or through email forms. Not even necessarily email. There, you go to email, it takes you to a form on their website, and you send in a message that way. And that's kind of the way the world is going, and we're a more interconnected world than we were even 10 years ago, probably. And there's a saying that everything on the internet is forever. So it would probably still be up there. And if it's not, it's probably because the game's not being played much by anybody. And initiative is stat. Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty static way to do initiative because you know that you're going to have that initiative every time. And so you're probably going to fall within a certain pecking order of initiative every time. If you have a really high initiative score, you're probably going to be close to the top every time. And if you have a bad one, you're probably going to be close to the bottom every time. So, that randomizer, it kind of mixes things up. But, for a game that I think ultimately is meant to be a light game, it makes some sense. I mean, it's pretty simple. You look down at your character sheet. What's your initiative? My initiative is 3. Okay, so you're going to go, and you're going to go, and you're going to go because you have a 3, and then some of the bad guys are going to go, and then you're going to go. So it's, for a light system, it makes sense. It's probably not something you'd want to have if you were playing some kind of, real gritty tactical system where positioning and timing and things like that mattered. But if it's just a matter of, what order you're going to go in. I mean, in it's not any different than systems I've seen where it's just, or not necessarily systems, but I think I've heard people describe that they do it this way, especially in the OSR community, is if it's in person and you're sitting around the table, it's okay, the person to the GM's left goes first, and then it works its way around. And so, because I've heard people say that they do that kind of thing so that people know, visually when it's about their turn to go. So they're not caught, pondering their character sheet or whatever. And they know, okay, I'm going to have to make a choice because, Jim went and Jane went. And as soon as Susan finishes taking her turn, it's my turn. So I've got to be ready. Because I've heard that as a trick to speed up combat, doing initiative that way. So it's not unheard of. It is predictable. For the game it's attached to, I think it works.
As far as critical hits, I don't know. I mean, if some of those systems are in place that you mentioned, they're all interesting ideas, they would work. I wonder how much mental gymnastics we're doing to try to get to that point, to try to fit them in. I mean, people like if you roll 20, you get a critical hit, do double damage, whatever, just do that. Keep it simple, I think. is the easiest way to do it. And I don't know, maybe I'm off base here, but I don't know that it's as big a problem. So in your experience at your gaming tables, has it been an issue, or is it an issue we're just discussing on air and kind of on our own? But is this an issue that's come up in your gaming groups, or is it an issue we're just talking about? I guess is maybe a question I have. Now, I'm not picking on you. That question is for you, your listeners as well, right? But Maddie, come on inside. Sorry, messing with the dogs. Anyhow, where's I going with that? Oh, critical hits. Yeah, I really like the idea of fighters as they go up in level, doing criticals on more, like 19 to 20, and then 18 to 20, and 17 to 20, and stuff like that. The other thing I really like is a variation of what happens in Best Buried, in variation what happens in Black Hack. And Rob Connolly over on his site, on his blog, has talked about this in the past. He does the Majestic Wonderlands, or no, Majestic, what's he call them? Yeah, maybe Majestic Wildlands. He was doing the stuff for Judges Guild, their Majestic Wonderlands, and then he's the one that actually exposed all the horrible racist stuff they were doing. And once they paid him, he made enough money to get out from what they owed him. He broke away from them now, and he's doing it all under his own thing, Bat in the Attic Games. And you can find his blog. But anyway, I like the idea of adopting it to where you have something like, as the fighters go up in level, most OSR games, the fighter gets to attack creatures 1 hit die or less a number of times equal to the level. Well, I think you expand that. So once they hit 4th level, they can attack, say, 2nd level or 2 hit die creatures and down the number of their level, right? And when they hit 6th level, 3 hit die creatures and down the number of their level. Maybe you cap it at 4 hit die or something, right? But I think that would also help fighters. And that's not a critical hit per se, but it's something I really like for the idea of fighters, to give them the chance to do more attacks and really be, more effective. Now, of course, this is just for D&D style, TSR D&D style OSR games, in games that use the separate numbers of attacks and things like that. Obviously we need to look at totally different things. But anyway, that's about all I have to say. Keep up.
Yeah. I also like the idea of criticals being very beneficial to your more martial type characters, your fighters in a lot of the OSR type rule sets, to give them a chance to escalate the damage they can do in the way that magic using classes can do with some of the really over the top spells that you get, especially the ones that the damage is level based. And I agree you wouldn't want to go too far with it, but you could tie it to the types of weapons they use. You can keep it pretty simple. I mean, current D&D, they divide it into martial weapons and simple weapons. They don't call it simple weapons; they call it something else. And so you could say if you have skill in martial weapons, you get this, and then the fighters could have something that they can do with criticals that maybe others can't. I know DCC, they have all their special dice, and they have dice that let the fighters do essentially stunts. I forget what they call them off the top of my head. I know somebody's going to mention it. I'm going like, yeah, that's what that's called. But there are systems that I think the Pathfinder 2, I think they have. I know I've heard Joe talk about it. You can expand your critical range. Certain classes can expand their critical range as they go up in level. And I think that's a good way to approach it, is to have, maybe some basic form of critical, because everybody likes to have, that unexpected bonus in combat. And, I'd be interested to hear, like you, actual play responses citing actual play circumstances. I know in probably the last couple of weeks, a couple of actual play podcasts I've listened to, there's a situation where a character was rolling at disadvantage and rolled 2 20s. And there was another situation where a character was, I don't know if they were rolling at advantage or disadvantage, but they rolled 2 1s. No, the character that was rolled 2 20s was rolling at disadvantage. So It was natural 20 either way. That's why it was, it was like, wow, okay. And that was their response. That was their response was wow. And on these podcasts that I've listened to with actual plays, when the game master rolls a natural 20 or whatever and says, hey, we rolled a natural 20, there's a, oh, shucks kind of reaction, but it's not usually, oh, this is terrible. Oh, no, we're going to get wiped out. So I haven't ever heard that kind of response to it. And I've just always been somewhat bemused with people who say, oh, it always puts the characters at a disadvantage. It can, if you're fighting a mass of goblins, it can put you at a disadvantage, but it can put you at a disadvantage. You can be at a disadvantage facing a mass of goblins if they just roll well. It doesn't necessarily, you can take crits out of the equation, and unless the characters are just so high level that your bog standard goblin isn't going to be able to hit them at all, if the goblins roll well, they're still going to have the potential to do more hits in that combat than characters are. But on the flip side, if a group of characters is fighting a dragon, the dragon has multiple attacks, but probably not as many attacks as the characters do. So, the entire scenario is flipped on its head in that situation. The characters have more opportunities to roll, so they have more opportunities for critical hits. And they, what I've seen and heard and experienced is, and this is completely not objective. This is completely subjective, because it's just what you've seen and what you remember, and what you remember is the exceptional. So you remember when, hey, remember that session that we rolled a crit every other roll, or remember that session that we rolled a fumble every other roll. Those are the things that stand out. So you're going to remember them more. So I think it's probably a circumstance of where crits and fumbles don't occur as often as we think they do. And overall, they probably match what the probabilities say it should be, which, it's 10% of the time you should get one or the other. So if you roll the dice 10 times, you should get one of each. But that can happen at any time, anywhere. Now, going back to what we were talking about a little earlier with cards, if you have a critical system, which Space Kings does, the Queen of Hearts is a critical success. So how often that's going to come up. It's going to come up one time out of every time you shuffle the cards. In the case of Space Kings, since you include the two jokers, you're going to get one out of every 54 times you flip a card. And again, with the jokers, which they're not fumbles, but they usually give a complication or negative consequence to what you're doing, it's going to be 2 out of every 54. Which is why they recommend in the book that if you have a lot of characters, everybody takes a joker out of their deck. So, I'd be interested to hear too from people who are playing, because I know there are people on the podcast I listen to, and some of them listen to this podcast, that play multiple campaigns on a weekly basis in a lot of cases. How often you see criticals and fumbles just really impact a session, that it really just puts you in a bad situation if it's fumbles and the opposition rolling criticals, or if it puts you in a really good situation if the opposition is rolling the fumbles and the party is rolling the criticals. But yeah, that's a very good question, and I do think having different kind of things that it can be one more thing that helps define the classes in some way. It's like exploding dice. When you have game systems with exploding dice that just to let you do buku as damage as long as you can keep rolling that max. You keep rolling that max. And if it's in a system where you're using D6s, you're going to roll that 6 a lot more often than you're going to roll that 20 on a D20. So, it's dependent on your table and your system. But I don't think, in a D20 based system, I don't think it's as bad as some people think it is. But if you did away with it, I don't know that a lot of people would really miss it that much, other than hearkening back, if they've played with criticals and they roll a 20, they're like, man, remember when rolling a 20 would mean that might be able to do 40 points of damage on this one roll? But it's a fun discussion. Oh, and one more thing. I know Rob at the Down on a Heap podcast, and I think I mentioned this on my last podcast and didn't credit him because at the time I didn't remember that I'd heard him say it, but I had to because I listen to his podcast all the time. He talked about magical weapons being the ones that do the criticals. You roll a critical with a magical weapon and you get an effect, a special effect from the weapon that way. And that's something that I've always found it's interesting because I've always thought, what if magical weapons, all magical weapons have the potential to do something, really good. And the weapons that already have defined special abilities or high bonuses built in, they've basically reached their potential. But your standard +1 magical weapon, maybe there's more it can do, and maybe that's something a critical could bring out, a sort of a chaos factor. There's actually more magical potential in this magic weapon than is used on a regular basis. But when you hit it just right, boom.
Hey, Pink Phantom, this is Jason. Just finished listening to episode 12, Critical Call-Ins. And I want to say it was an interesting episode, interesting thoughts. As far as, Hank Infernal is the guy behind Runehammer Games, ICRPG. He does not identify himself as OSR, by the way. He does not consider himself OSR. He considers himself DIY, and he prefers not to be associated with OSR. That said, he's a very positive force in the RPG community. I'm a big fan. I back him on Patreon. And yeah, I think it's great that he's out there and he brings a lot of positive energy to the community. But but to be fair to him, we shouldn't be calling him OSR. I know you didn't, but I want to throw that out there because he's really not OSR. It's not fair to call him OSR if he doesn't consider himself OSR. You know what I mean? And I know you didn't do that, but that's who that is. It's Runehammer Games. Now, as far and I would agree with you. Joe is not OSR; he's RPG. And honestly, I'm not OSR, right? You listen to my podcast. I talk about all kinds of things. I end up defending OSR games sometimes and defending TSR games and AD&D First Edition and stuff. And I have nostalgia for that stuff, but they're not my preferred games, for example, right? So, I don't think I should personally. I don't care if somebody wants to call me OSR, but really I'm not. You know what I mean? Anyhow, as far as the loud voices, I wonder. So I'm not on the Twitter or the Facebook or the MeWe. I don't watch the TikTok videos or log into MySpace. So I really can't talk about social media accurately. When you see these posts from the bad actors in the OSR, like Venture St. Tanis, or the quote-unquote bad actors, I guess, because, I vaguely know who they are. Anyway, point is, are these posts their posts, or are they posts other people complaining about them? Is the reason they're the loudest voice because other people complain or pointing them out, and non-OSR people are saying these are the worst people? Would new TSR have all the press they have if other people didn't complain about them? Is it their doing, or is it other people, bringing it up and talking about it? So is the reason they're the loudest voices not through their efforts, but because other people are bitching about them? That's my question. And at that point, the problem, while they're a problem, they're not the problem. The problem is everybody else looking and grabbing the perfect thing to pick on the OSR. You know what I mean? So really the problem is all the people bringing them up. Now, that may or may not be true because I'm not on all those social platforms and I can't speak to it. But that's kind of my question for that. I'm not saying we act like these people never exist, and if it's brought up in conversation, we should be educated and we should talk and we should be able to answer that, hey, that's not the standard and, this and that. And we should be able to defend the OSR and defend gaming from people like that, because really it's not defending the OSR as much as defending gaming, because they're, even if they identify as OSR, their bad habits and bad things, if they're gatekeeping, if they're being racist, if they're doing these things, that affects gaming as a whole, not just the OSR. So we need to be able to answer those questions. But I don't know that we need to give them airtime spontaneously. I think we give them airtime. If somebody asks the question, we say, yes, that person's out there, they're saying that, but they don't represent the hobby. Here are good sources of who do represent the hobby and better places to look for RPG content. But I don't know that we need to spend blog space and Twitter posts saying, oh, look at these horrible people. How, I don't know. That's just kind of my take on it. And this is getting kind of long, so I'll send a different message about critical hits.
Good day, sir. Kevin calling in from Red Kevin Podcast. Last message might be all kinds of jumbled, so you can ignore it. The Professor Dungeon Master, yes, that's who I was referring to, and you are correct. He is more general than strictly OSR, but his own game system and most of his advice, I think, applies very good to OSR, and he has that kind of vibe. I was referring to Runehammer, Hankrin Infernal, creator of the Index Card RPG, huge YouTube channel. I may have mumbled. It was late. I apologize. I do agree with your overall thought, though, that it does really depend on what circles you travel in. And I guess maybe because I've been deep into the OSR side, I see a lot more of the positive, and I kind of tune out the negative. And I can see how somebody who's on the outside may only see the negative. I just would prefer that we publicize the positive folks and kind of ignore or stop giving air to the negative folks. But anyhow, great episode. Talk to you again soon.
Hey, Pink Phantom. I wanted to pick up on this circles we move in idea. And I completely understand where Joe's coming from. And I was just thinking more about my frustrations around that. See, I'm a member of an OSR group on Facebook that's an extremely progressive space, and I view the guys that Joe talks about more as trolls than anything else, which is why I've got no interest in talking about them. And it disappoints me whenever I see people in that Facebook group devoting time and energy to deriding those people, because to me it seems like a sideshow. Although I completely understand why you would want to call that stuff out. I think of myself as what some people might call second generation OSR, because when I discovered it, there were already people talking about it being dead, and that was 4 or 5 years ago. And it may seem like like revisionism, but these self-proclaimed champions of the OSR, or whatever you want to call them, have never been part of the communities I was aware of, if you know what I mean. When I think about the big names in the community, I'm not thinking about crusty old white dudes. I'm thinking about creators that include women, people of gay and transgender community, folks of a variety of different ethnic backgrounds, and these were exactly the kind of people who regularly featured on Frothsoft's Thought Eater podcast, a podcast all about that OSR blogosphere. And a great show that if you're not aware of, I can highly recommend. And it is sadly missed, but it was interesting that you mentioned Wobblies and Wizards there, because that again is a great podcast which kind of continues in that same theme. It does what Froth was doing in focusing on this sort of hotbed of creativity. These blogs that I discovered when I was investigating this movement that I was being told was already dead. Just really, really interesting stuff.
All right. So the first thing I want to say is to Kevin. First of all, to Kevin and Jason, thank you for specifying about Runehammer. As soon as I heard Runehammer, I knew who y'all were talking about. And to Kevin, I don't think it was it was your pronunciation or anything. I just didn't know. I didn't know his name. I'm bad with names. That's not an excuse, but I am bad with names. But I knew Runehammer. I knew, and as soon as you said Runehammer, I knew who you were talking about. And I find it instructive from Jason's comment. Well, informative from Jason's comment that he considers himself DIY, not OSR. And I think a lot of that ties into just some of the baggage that is tied to OSR in some segments of the RPG community. And we've been talking a lot about, specifically what we've been calling bad actors and, people that are kind of defiantly as I think Spencer said, trolling people, because that's sort of their brand. That's what they're doing. Some of it is probably marketing, and some of it is just probably they feel like that their viewpoints are being targeted because they are who they are. And I've seen this a lot, and I'm going to be honest, a lot of time when I've tried, I don't think I've made this clear, when I've talked about what we call bad actors, or just some of the baggage that goes with, negative baggage that goes with the terminology OSR, I'm not necessarily talking about those guys. I mean, that's kind of how this discussion has the direction this discussion has gone into. But those guys, they're going to be who they are. And, if they want to make it their brand to be that type of person, then they are. What I'm really talking about is and this is partially an answer to Jason's question, when I see the subject come up, sometimes it is where somebody like New TSR that has kind of been established or documented as having said some, at best, inelegant things, and at worst, downright bad things, that when they come up, there is a knee-jerk reaction that, immediately, oh, here's that person, and they're terrible, and here's why they're terrible. Because, it's all backstory, right? The backstory keeps building, and if they make things worse, I think their public relations has been, virtually non-existent. Or it's had their narrative, if you want to use that word, to go backwards. I think that a lot of what I see is just somebody talking about the term OSR. A lot of times it's just, something's been tagged, and because I follow a lot of older school OSR type people, I get stuff in my feed with folks talking about their experience with maybe with those OSR type people, or maybe just with general OSR type people, and it's been bad. And it's not about there's this brand name, there's that brand name, they're selling stuff as the OSR. It's where they've been interested maybe in what the OSR is, and they've looked for groups or they've looked for people, and the encounters have been negative because it is, in some cases, because it is the old white guy, right? The stereotype. I mean, there's a reason why the term neckbeard is used as an epithet in some circles on the internet, that they are not very approachable, that they're very insular, and that they are, they're racist, sexist, whatever. A female asks them a question and they react in a negative way, or a derogatory way, or condescending way. Or the same thing if it's a person of color, or a person of a transgender person, or somebody with their pronouns in their Twitter bio. They prefer to be referred to as she, they, or he, they, or they, them. And there are circles that they just take great offense to what's in that person's bio. And this is not big brand names. And in a lot of cases, the stuff I see, and a lot of this is on Twitter, but I've seen it, on forums and stuff too, that, this is a negative. the fact that you're putting your pronouns means you're a woke commie. And some of that is older people, and some of that is, I think, it's people who are they're reactionary to what they perceive as the world, where the world is going. They think the world is going away from their lifestyle. The gaming world is going away from their style of play. The world is going away from their style of living and what they believe in. And so they feel oppressed. And they feel like they're being victimized and that somebody's trying to force them out of what they consider their corner of the gaming world or the internet world. And it's more these kind of every people interactions that I see that I think is not something that we need to, there doesn't need to be some big address. Everybody that's going to, October is coming up and we want to kind of show the positive side of the older school styles of play in the OSR in October, the October OSR, whatever we end up calling it. And, that's great. I think that's the way it should be. But I guess and we're kind of an insular community, so we know we're going to listen to each other and we're going to respond to each other, and the responses are probably going to be pretty positive and they're going to be more discussion oriented. But I mean, it's the internet. There's a chance that a particular podcast or a particular episode will get out of kind of our little community to somewhere else and get shared and maybe get misinterpreted, or because the term OSR is used, and then we may have a different batch of questions, a different batch of responses coming at us. And I just think it's something we need to be aware of, and to be aware that these folks are not necessarily just reacting because of the new TSR. And, we've already used his name, so I'll use it, Vendra Satanis, and others who specifically are going after that audience, the audience of people who are reactionary toward how the RPG world is changing and how the world at large is changing, and how, they are reacting negatively. And so, people are marketing to that. I mean, there's even been a digital storefront that has been started for RPG products because a group of people have perceived that Drive-Thru RPG is censoring them because they have a certain viewpoint. They have a certain viewpoint on RPGs, or they have a certain viewpoint on the world. They have a certain viewpoint about what's acceptable in materials. And so, they are so offended by what Drive-Thru RPG is, they're trying to start up their own company and drive them out of business. Well, I don't know if they're trying to drive them out of business. I shouldn't say that, but they're trying to start up their own company that isn't, where they're not restricted because they feel restricted. So the entire reason I started talking about this was just because we need to be aware. Because if you're not aware and you don't understand that people are encountering resistance from people who proclaim themselves as OSR or as old school, or I've been gaming for 40 years, or whatever it is, then you're more likely to respond negatively toward them in return, and that just builds. Because there are people who, from a newer RPG perspective, who do have such utter disdain for anything to do with the term OSR that they do seek it out to degrade it and to demean it. And, for whatever reason, because of the way they were treated, or because the way they perceived they were treated, or just because it suits them, because they are as offended of the OSR style of play as some people who have an OSR style play are offended by the newer ways of playing RPGs. So yeah, there are the quote unquote big names who purposely put their names out there and try to tie it to the OSR and try to be as offensive as possible to people that they think don't agree with them. And there are people who seek out a way to be as disagreeable as possible to anybody that has OSR on a tweet or on a post. But it's out there. But I do believe that what we do in October should be very positively motivated, should be very positively oriented and directed toward, there are some things in the old school style play that they're timeless. And there are some things in the old school style play that we enjoy that maybe some people haven't tried because they're 30 or 40 years old. But ultimately, it should be about saying, it's at the end of the day, and I think everybody in this community has probably said this at one time or another, it's about your game your way. And, if you don't want to call it OSR, then you don't have to. If Runehammer says, he says, I'm DIY, great. If Professor Dungeon Master says, I'm D&D, great. And there are things that they do that are, and if they do things that are older school oriented, that can be instructive to people that won't listen to anybody that says it's OSR. And that's going to do it for another episode of Phantom Thoughts. If you have any feedback you'd like to leave, you can contact me by leaving a voice message at anchor.fm/the-pink-phantom, or you can send an email to thepinkphantom1@gmail.com, or you can contact me on Twitter @thepinkphantom. The music in this episode was Strength of the Titans and Late Night Radio by Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0 license from creativecommons.org/licenses/by/4.0.